You're listening to episode 294 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Joan and Ann Watts join us to speak about their book about their father, The Collected Letters of Alan Watts. For those interested, applications are now open for the mindfulness-based stress reduction program starting in July of 2018. It's online, live, from the convenience of your home, and offered on a donation basis. This is the full 8-week program developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn, used as the gold standard for the scientific study of secular mindfulness. And this is the only MBSR online live program that doesn't have an upfront price of hundreds of dollars. At the end of the program, participants simply make the donation they can. To apply, please visit presentmomentmindfulness.com. I would also like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us on the conversation. Philosopher, author, and lecturer Alan Watts popularized Zen Buddhism and other Eastern philosophies for the counterculture of the 1960s. Today, new generations are finding his writings and lectures online, while faithful followers worldwide continue to be enlightened by his teachings. The Collected Letters of Alan Watts reveals the remarkable arc of Watts' colorful and controversial life. From his school days in England to his priesthood in the Anglican Church as chaplain of Northwestern University, to his alternative lifestyle and experimentation with LSD in the late 60s. His engaging letters cover a vast range of subject matter, with recipients ranging from high church clergy to high priests of psychedelics, government officials, publishers, critics, family, and fans. They include C.G. Jung, Henry Miller, Gary Snyder, Aldous Huxley, Timothy Leary, Joseph Campbell, and James Hillman. Watts' letters were curated by his two daughters, our guests today, Joan and Ann Watts, who have added behind-the-scenes biographical commentary. Joan Watts grew up in the United States and England, and also studied sumi-e, Japanese ink painting, in Japan. Her art has won awards in juried shows and hangs in many private collections. In addition to her art career, she spent 25 years as a successful fundraiser in the nonprofit world. She retired in her 50s and moved to Montana, where for 20 years she was an occasional fishing guide and operated a bed and breakfast that catered to fly fishers from around the world. After retiring again, she began, along with her sister Anne, editing her father's letters for publication, and resumed her painting. She is the mother of 5 successful, happy children and 9 grandchildren. She lives in Livingston, Montana with her husband, Johnny Montana Hale, a musician, songwriter, and retired motion picture industry technician. Most of her life decisions have been influenced in one way or another by her father, Alan Watts. Anne Watts' philosophies were also strongly shaped by her experience as the daughter of Alan Watts. Anne is a certified hypnotherapist and an educator and counselor in the areas of human sexuality, sexual abuse, family stress, self-esteem, healing the inner child, and financial and aging issues. Since 1985, she has facilitated hundreds of workshops in the United States, Canada, Australia, Japan, England, and Germany with the Human Awareness Institute, work she is deeply passionate about. Since 2008, she has also been a regular faculty member at Esalen Institute. Anne is the proud mother of 2 children and 3 grandsons. She lives in Santa Rosa, California, a deeply loving relationship with her husband, Mark, who has also been her partner since 1984. Special thanks to Tristy Taylor and Monique Mullenkamp of New World Library for arranging today's interview. So sit back, relax, and have a nice megawatt tea. Our guests today are Joan Watts. Joan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
And Anne Watts. Anne, welcome to you as well.
Thank you very much.
It's such an honor to meet both of you. And before we get started, I'm going to just get out of the way my own personal story with this. My godmother, some years ago, sent me a newspaper clipping when she found out and learned more about what I was doing in my adult life. And it was a talk that your father was giving in Chicago somewhere, I think in the 60s. And I've moved, so I've lost track of that, but I have it here somewhere. And so it was just a wonderful honor when the folks at New World Library reached out and said that, A, this book existed at all, that this was something that was coming out, and that there was the opportunity to speak with both of you. So thank you both so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having us. It's our pleasure.
So let's dive right in. What I'd like to know first is just how the idea of the book came about. And for listeners of the podcast, Joan and Anne are sitting next to each other, so I'll let them decide how they want to figure out who goes first.
Well, we acquired this mess of a file at the time of our stepmother's death in 1992, Alan's widow. And things were quite a mess in cardboard boxes. And we needed to make sense out of it. And I actually hired a gal that had worked for me before, and we had her clean it up and put papers in proper file folders and so on. And that all moved with me to Montana when I left the Bay Area and sat in my office for about 20 years. I would occasionally go in to look at the files to answer questions for some agent or some publisher or something that needed to be dealt with. And of course, I noticed letters in there and would occasionally pull out a file of letters and look at it. One of the more interesting ones I pulled was a file of correspondence with Timothy Leary. And then just a couple years ago, we were meeting with the editor at New World Library. They were republishing some of Alan's books that were out of print. And I mentioned to him that we had some letters, and he kind of perked up and said, "Letters?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, have you thought of publishing them?" And I said, "Well, yes, it would be a good idea." And he said, "Well, we need to find an editor to do that, to go through them." And I said, "I don't think so. I think that Anne and I can do it." So that's how it started. And amazingly enough, we were supposed to produce a manuscript of 300 pages. We produced a manuscript of 600 pages and about 400 letters. And of course, he said, "Well, we're going to have to cut some of this." And I said, "Well, great. You go ahead and see what you can do."
Good luck.
He couldn't. he said, no, they're all so good. I can't see cutting. I would think we cut maybe 2 or 3 letters, but that was about it. So that's why it's quite the volume that it is. It's beautifully done. We've had many compliments on the beauty of the book in terms of the layout and the paper and the cover. And then, of course, the content. People just love the letters.
Anne, what would you like to add to that story? First, did your sister say the right story?
Oh yeah, she did. That's exactly how it came down. Yeah, and it took us close to 2.5 years to do all this. And it was really quite a rigorous experience. And Joan did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of having somebody help put all of those letters into the computer, because a lot of them couldn't be easily scanned because they were carbon copies. And so, I mean, the letters to Alan's parents were all saved by his parents. And we think that about the time he wrote his autobiography, that they sent those letters to him to help him. And so we've got all those letters as he wrote them. But it was quite a process to put it all together. And then, we edited as much as we could before we sent it to the publishers. And I think it was it was an emotional ride, and it was a bonding time for Joan and myself, I think. So that was pretty special.
So I just one quick technical question on that. Did your father tend to write his letters with a typewriter, or were there some handwritten letters in there? What was the original body of work like?
Most of it was typed, and he he typed a lot. A lot of the letters were like 3 pages single spaced.
Mm-hmm.
So he was a great typist. I loved watching him type. He used his 2 fingers and a thumb, and I was taught to use all 10 fingers when I took typing class, but he just could type right away, and he was very accurate. Going through carbon copies, how you can see where people have made mistakes. He didn't make many, if any.
That's interesting.
And the other thing that Joan and I did was in between some of the letters, or along with some of the letters, we wrote our own background to what was happening to make it more clear for the readers. And a lot of people have really appreciated that we did that. Like we're just bringing more perspective to the overall story. So.
Yeah, the context was very helpful in those parts where your note showed up, and there's some interesting things that I'll want to get to in this. But I also wanted to ask, just in the little bit that I've been able to see the two of you online, you have a really wonderful way of sisters being together, and I'm curious if you've collaborated on any other projects before this one, or is this really the big one for both of you?
I would say this was the big one. We haven't really collaborated on other things, other than there were a few years where we lived in the same town. So we, as adults, and our families were together. But other than that, we've lived apart for a good portion of our lives.
Quite a lot apart. Mm-hmm. Like, I live in Santa Rosa, California, and Joan lives in Montana. So
there's some distance there. Yeah.
About 1,000 miles.
So for those who are listening to the podcast, it is a very, and I mean this in a very good way, it is a dense book. It's not a light read. It's not a quick read. And that's actually one of the things I really like about it, is that there is a robustness and a depth to this, as well as some wonderful pictures that you shared in the middle part as well. So I'm curious if you had read these letters before beginning to work on the project, and you had mentioned just, looking now and then, but had either of you done a comprehensive read through at any point before you started working on this book?
No, we hadn't. I think it was in 2015 that Anne came to Montana and spent a week in the month of July. And we, at that point, went through almost every file in the file drawers. There are 2 legal-size file drawers packed. And of course, there were things other than letters. There were, royalty statements, correspondence with publishers, some of which we used, original manuscripts, and so on. So there was a lot of paper in those drawers that we went through, and it was time to start choosing the letters. We just, we'd read through them and we'd say yay, nay, go in a yes pile or a no pile. So it was quite a job. And I have a daughter who helped me initially with some of the scanning, and then I hired somebody because it was obviously going to take a lot of time and effort. She worked for me 2 days a week, and I worked 7 days a week, and scanned, proofed, put it into Word, whatever, it just took a lot of time. That was really the first read, and, I was amazed at the quality of the letters, just beautiful, very descriptive, informative. His brilliance just came through.
I wanted to ask about that. What surprises did you uncover? What was there for each of you? Something that you either hadn't known or made you go, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
For me, just to start with, as Joan said, his early brilliance, seeing how this teenager wrote to Carl Jung as if he was an equal, and to Christmas Humphreys, who was quite a bit his senior, again, old enough to be his father, and still he just maintained a totally equal correspondence with him as well as relationship. I mean, they became very close friends. That to me was really interesting, how connected he was like that. Another thing is he heard about this Japanese man who was living in New York, who was an extraordinary Zen teacher. And he wrote to him, and his name is Sokian Sasaki. And so they had an occasional correspondence. Interestingly, when Alan married our mother, Eleanor, and then they moved to New York, he met Sokian, and Sokian became his teacher for a short period of time, and eventually became his stepfather-in-law, married to our mother's mother. So there's a whole story that's recently been published about that, which is really interesting. So it's a great story.
Thank you, Anne. And Joan, how about for you? What was some things that were new and interesting that you discovered in the letters?
Well, I think first of all, I was really impressed with his scholarly ability. He was an amazing scholar, mastering Latin and Greek, and the quality and the quantity of information he knew about both Christian doctrine and Asian philosophies was just amazing to me. I mean, he must have been a speed reader. That's all I can say. But just in his letters and his interaction with other officials, or official isn't the right word, but other knowledgeable people in those fields, he was able to communicate so well, and that was just pretty fascinating. And his broad interest in things, that was the other part of it. He wasn't so narrowly focused. Even later in his life, he started being interested in other things like quantum physics, and just, he was interested in cooking, food, politics. Amazing.
And you'd also mentioned earlier when we began speaking that there were some emotional arisings for you as you were going through these. I'm wondering if there's a little bit of that you might be willing to share, what it was like going through this and what came up for each of you.
Well, I've had quite a journey in my life of needing to heal my own inner child, which has created my working with other people and healing their inner children. And one of the things that I've learned along the way is that memory is a very fallible thing. What one person remembers, somebody else may remember very differently. And so for me, when I went through these letters, what I saw was confirmation of my memories, which was quite amazing to me. And when Joan was born, our parents were really in the fullness of their love for each other. And it was just, everything was exciting and beautiful. And they were so in love with Joan. And my experience was Joan was the beloved child. And when I came along, my parents' marriage was falling apart. My mother really, I felt, didn't want me. She didn't want me, especially because I wasn't a boy and she wanted a boy. And my experience was that she took a lot of her unhappiness out on me. And then later, my stepmother, that was my experience as well, that she took a lot of her unhappiness out on me. And so by the age of 9, I had a stomach ulcer. So talking about these things with Joan and her talking about her efforts to be an ally for me when she was around, because she was off and off at boarding school and she wasn't around. But, she got to see what was going on firsthand and was very unhappy about it. And, so I felt that was part of what was so bonding for us. And so, yeah, that was an emotional journey to go through.
Thank you, Anne. Joan, how about you? Were there any surprising emotions that came up or something particularly strong for you?
Well, I guess embarrassment was one of them. In his early letters, especially, he dwelt a lot of time talking about me and how I was developing, and he would make comments about how beautiful I was and how my clothes were, and da 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 da. I just was, I was stunned. I was like, wow. And then I felt badly for my sister reading those letters, because I felt like she was kind of left out of the loop on that part. But then when she was older and married and so on, then the things reversed a little bit, because he recognized her bohemian life as more compatible with him, and that my life as the wife of an aspiring executive in the business world was not quite edgy enough.
Thank you. So, for many people, there may be an impression that arises when they hear the name Alan Watts. And for each of you, this is your dad. And I'm curious, what is the impression each of you has when you hear the name Alan Watts? Does it go into the place of this different person, or is it, oh, Dad? Is there some mix? What is it like for you?
Well, first of all, interestingly, I have never referred to him as Dad. He's either my father or Daddy. The word Dad is so 50s Leave It to Beaver type characteristic, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But I always thought of him as being, I always thought of him as being very interesting. I have to say that. And it was always enjoyable being with him when he was around and engaging with us. But I think the thing that bothered me more was people that would immediately put him on some kind of pedestal if they found out I was the daughter of Alan Watts. It was like, oh my goodness, really? And how lucky you are, what is it like, all that type of thing. That was a little hard to take sometimes, because it was like looking past me and not really. I mean, one person told me one time, well, you look too ordinary to be the daughter of Alan Watts. Things like that were kind of unfortunate, I think, but
like Joan says, our parents were mommy and daddy, just like his parents were.
Yeah.
We called our parents mommy and daddy, and so I often refer to him as daddy, or like Joan, our father, or Alan, because that's a universal name that people know him by. I really loved him, and often when we were together, people often ask what was it like. Well, he was very playful and fun to be with, and when he was with us, we felt very cared for by him. And the letters reflect that caring. However, he was gone a lot of the time. He was either doing lecture tours or he was writing, and he was very focused on his writing. And there was a point when I went to him and asked him for some support, and it wasn't available. And I just gave up on him. as a dad in a certain sense, as a father. And it was a really powerful moment for me as a kid. And today the term that I would use is he saw what was happening, but he wasn't willing to be my ally. And so I just had to let go of hoping that he would be. It's that kind of a mix.
That's a good segue, I think, into what kinds of influences he's had on your lives, both as the persona of Alan Watts and as your father, that there is that mix. And I'm wondering for each of you, what has been the strongest influence that he's had on you in whatever role that may be, even a mixed one?
For me, I think a lot of what I overheard as a kid when he would give lectures and stuff, and I'd be in the background. And so a lot of his philosophical thoughts and ideas, they just came into my being. And so I was never a student of Alan Watts. I was never a student of Zen. I was never any of that. But I find that when I listen to him now, I'm going, yeah, right, exactly. That's what I think. That's what I believe.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of transmission, so to speak. And the other thing for me is I work with people a lot. And I think I inherited from my father a compassionate listening, because he was like that. He was a compassionate listener and listened very deeply. And I feel like that's something I inherited in some way. I always laugh and say I inherited his big mouth. Although I'm not anywhere nearly as loquacious as he was, like I'm a natural introvert and he was a natural extrovert. And so for me, it's more of a struggle to come out like that. I've learned to do it, but it's not my natural state of being. So, that's a difference that I have. Now, have you had some time to think about it?
Well, I think what Anne said too about I'm definitely an introvert as well. And so I didn't inherit his ability to put myself out there. But in terms of my life, I feel like he did have a tremendous influence. And when I found myself straying sort of off the path, I always came back. I even felt a bit like I mirrored his life in a sense that he had 3 marriages, I've had 3 marriages. And the pieces in between are similar in some ways, which is very interesting to me.
So in going through the letters, I'm wondering if there was either a personal favorite letter that stands out for you, or maybe a period in time. What's the part that you like best about what has shown up in this book?
I think probably the part that I enjoy the most is his time towards the end of his life, actually, the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, because he, at that point, was meeting so many interesting people and involving himself in so many interesting things. And he kind of became a bon vivant in a sense. And it was exciting. Not that I necessarily agreed with some of his life choices, like alcohol and tobacco, etc. But the companionship, the people that came around, and so on, were just wonderful, interesting people, and that was really an interesting time, I think.
How about for you, Anne?
Yeah, I'm kind of like, definitely I don't have a favorite letter, but I start with when he like the very first letter we put in the book, which was a letter to his father celebrating his birthday, and it's an illustrated letter, and the illustration is in the book, and with a parade of rabbits, and it is the cutest thing, and it was like it was his way, because he was away at school and he couldn't be with his father on that occasion. This was the gift he gave him, was this drawing of this procession. It was stunning. It's just so adorable and cute and heartwarming. And then later, when he and our mother came to New York, he writes letters home describing what the countryside is like and what it looks like and the lights at night and all of that. And it's just the artist in him is really present in these writings because it's you can see what he's describing. You're right there with him. And then, like Joan, in his later years, many of the political letters that he wrote defending the Native Americans or really, he wrote to the top people saying, wait, pay attention, take a look at this. And part of that was to get police out of the bedroom, to not make marijuana illegal because it would lead to major problems if they did that, which of course it did. And LSD, things that he felt were better taken care of by the medical community than the police community. And so all of those things I thought were really interesting. And then, as Joan says, the luminaries that he knew and who were part of our lives over the years, that was always part of the color of our life.
Yeah, I think some of his letters are quite amusing too, which is kind of fun. I mean, he sent a letter to a restaurant in Sausalito, California. He and a group of friends had gone to the restaurant to eat, and they weren't allowed in because they were wearing sandals with no socks on. And he wrote this great letter about why should we conform to having to have our feet in sweaty leather shoes. It was very amusing, and that they ought to look at their dress code and relax a bit on that. So that was interesting. And then he took on the food industry as well, about how our food is so processed at this point that it doesn't taste real anymore, and gave an example of going back to his father's garden and having potatoes that his father had grown, and said, "It's not my palate that's jaded. It's the food that's bad, and this tastes delicious. It's still like I remembered it as a child." So those were some interesting observations he made that I thought was amusing letters.
Yeah, me too.
So I'm wondering what each of you is hoping, someone who gets the book and looks through it, what are you hoping that they'll find? What are you hoping they'll get out of reading these letters?
I'm hoping two things. Those people who already know Alan's work, that they'll get a more complete picture of the man. And this book shows many different sides of him. It shows, like the child and that side. It shows his playfulness and all of that. And it shows his depth of thought and brilliance, as we've said before. And it also shows the evolution of his thinking, which I think is really pretty amazing. And for people who haven't encountered Alan Watts, I think it's a delicious entry into who he is, and I hope it will inspire them to want to read more, because, Joan and I hear from people all the time that their lives have been changed because of their experience with Alan's works. Mm-hmm. And that I love to hearing that. That's a beautiful thing.
Thank you, Anne. And Joan, how about you?
The one thing that struck me in a lot of his letters, especially his more contemplative letters where he's thinking about his beliefs and so on, that he feels that people take the attitude that they're somehow separate from the universe. And he would espouse that everybody should realize that they're part of this huge whole universe, and we're all connected in various ways, and that we really needed to be more all encompassing of people's beliefs and people's races, probably, and people's religious thought, etc. And I think he was really hoping for perhaps, maybe you could call it more utopian ideals, but definitely that we get away from the thought that we're just separate beings and that we need to take care of the things around us, the people around us, the planet around us, and so on. And I'm very encouraged by the number of youth that are currently interested in his writing and his lectures on YouTube, and the dialogue that goes on Facebook pages that are dedicated to his work. And I'm really sort of hopeful of some sort of paradigm shift that might occur because of that, that we can get out of the some of the strife that we are currently in, people hating each other and divisive politics and divisive beliefs in different countries, religious and so on, that maybe there will be an awakening that our youth will bring to us.
Thank you. Well, for those who are listening to the episode, come to the episode page where this book, and I'll put a few others as well, of Alan's work will be available. Our guest today, Joan, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And Anne, thank you as well.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.